All right, so in this certification, you learn about how a computer works, and we always think of desktop. Somebody says computer, people think of a desktop computer, but it's just all computers. Anything that has computer components in it functions the same way. And so your phone is doing the exact same thing. Well, one of the things they mention is virtual memory. And so we're going to take a look at what virtual memory is, why it's there, and then we'll look at bottlenecks of a computer. All right, so virtual memory is a space that's used on your storage device to act as RAM. So you got a hard disk and it's a 2 terabyte hard drive and you've got 3 gigs of RAM. You're going to have a portion of your hard disk that will pretend to be RAM. Now you can imagine that if your hard disk is pretending to be RAM, it's going to be a lot slower. RAM is very, very fast. And so if you're having to use a storage device, even if that storage device is a solid state drive, it's going to be slower than the RAM that's in the machine. Now we can go and look at these settings. So if you pull up system that's in control panel, and you can get to that through the new settings, and then going to system info there, and then going to advanced system settings, you'll get this little dialog box. And if you have experience with PCs, then you're familiar with what this is, but most people don't dig in this far. Well, on the advanced tab of system properties, so you've got computer name here and hardware, you can get to device manager and so on. The advanced tab actually shows performance, and these are visual effects, processor scheduling, memory usage, and virtual memory. So let's look at those settings. You'll notice that here is a bunch of settings there for you. Lots of things that you can do. And this is really useful if you've got a really, really low end, like one of those stream PCs, which are really nice, Windows devices, but they're meant to be cheap. So it costs you a couple of $100 and they don't come with a whole lot. You can change this, right? You can come in here and turn all of this off. So all those visual effects just kind of go away and the processor doesn't have to worry about them. But anyway, we want to take a look at the advanced tab where our virtual memory is. Now, we really don't ever need to change this anymore. We used to. But these days, the computer handles this for us. So it really does a good job. But you can change it if you like. So a virtual memory is also called a paging file. And actually, in Linux, they set up a whole partition that's meant for swapping. So there's a few terms that are used with this. You'll hear people say swap file. You'll hear people say virtual memory. You'll hear people say paging file. And they use that term paging because they're taking pages. That's what they call that, pages in and out of RAM. Or they're swapping information in and out of RAM. And so this is telling us right here, our total paging file size for all of our hard disks is basically 2 gigs, 2.4 gigs. And so what it does is it takes a percentage. That's all it does. It takes a look and it says, well, let me see, they've got 2 terabytes, so I'll take this percentage. And then, of course, the space gets really low, it'll take that away. Now, the bad thing about this is if I had 16 gigs of RAM, I shouldn't ever really need that virtual memory, but Windows is programmed to use it, and most operating systems are programmed to use it. If you have something on the machine running, but you haven't looked at it and done anything with it for 10 minutes or so, it's going to actually take that, flush it out of RAM, and put it down in this virtual RAM space, this virtual memory space, paging file or virtual drive. It's going to put it down in there because you're not using it. So why not clear up RAM for when you do click on something else and you load it, right? Boom, 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 there it goes, it's running. And a really good example of it is actually our phones, where people just open apps and open apps and open apps and they never close them. And it used to be, right, when these first mobile OSs came out, we'd say, oh, you need to close all those because you're using up resources. But of course, we don't do that now because those operating systems have become more streamlined. And basically, all they're going to do is just save the state to the hard disk. And it's not really running. It's just got a little placeholder there. So when you click on it, it loads it off of, shouldn't say hard disk, the storage space, and it's running again. Well, this is the same thing that's happening on your computer, and you can actually change these. You can move the file around and tell it, I don't want that, I only want this certain size. But the honest truth is if your system's running fine, then you shouldn't change it at all. I came in here so I could show you that indeed there is a file on your computer that behaves like it's RAM, like it's a part of RAM, and your computer is going to use that. Now let's get to really why. Well, back in the day when they had very little RAM to use, these paging files, these virtual memory spaces were vital. You just, people, the RAM was just expensive, man. You know, you get a computer, and if you wanted more RAM, and it was going to cost you $300, $400 more for like 16 more megs of RAM. It was expensive stuff. And so you needed the ability to have this virtual space so that it would run. Let me show you. Most people have not seen this either, but some of you have. We're going to look at Task Manager now. Task Manager, you can actually just pull up by right-clicking down here on the taskbar and going to Task Manager. You can also Control-Alt-Delete and get to Task Manager that way, or you can search for it and pull up Task Manager. Now, Task Manager does not normally come up this way. So Task Manager usually looks like this when it first launches. That's what you see. But it will remember what you did last time. So mine came up this way because I always have it on the details, and it'll always show those details. You don't have to, you know, click opening. It's a fantastic little program here that shows you what's really happening. So it shows you the apps that are running. It shows you the background processes that are running, because right, there's a lot of things that support those apps. Lots of these background processes running, tons of them. But you can see that, see how much CPU they're using? Not much at all. How much memory they're using? Not much at all. One of the misnomers, one of the things that people don't understand is that putting in more RAM doesn't automatically make your computer faster. Adding more hard disk space storage doesn't automatically make it faster. As a matter of fact, putting in a faster CPU doesn't automatically. Now that one has the most effect, it's true. And you know, another CPU, I had a 1.4 and I put a 1.6 in it. But if you actually went from, say, a 2.4 CPU to a 2.6 CPU, you would tell yourself it looked faster. Because the honest truth is you really wouldn't be able to know. There's a lot of things going into what makes a computer function correctly. So we're going to go over and look at the Performance tab. This is a nice tab. We can see how much the CPU is being used. Right now I'm making a video, so it should be used. And I could go over and look and see, oh, look at that, Zoom is using the CPU heavily. But we should see this kind of erratic behavior, this kind of mountainscape, right? It should go up and down. It shouldn't actually ever be like this right here. It should come down way lower. Mine is probably like this because I got a ton of stuff open, right? There's tons of things open there. So if you have a bunch of stuff open, there it is. All right, so the CPU though is really only being used not even half, right? So then we look at the memory right here. This is the RAM that I have. And I have, according to this system, I have 8 gigs if you remember that. Maybe back over here. 8 gigs right there. That's what it says that I have. And then over here, it's more confusing as to what I'm seeing. I've got 3 gigs available, and there's 4.3 in use, so I could calculate that and figure out that that's 8 there. But I've also, this says that I've got 10. Well, this system's got kind of a shared graphics thing going on, so it looks a little different. But Windows, you need to know, uses about 3.5 gigs all on its own. So Windows uses that. So if you have a system with 4 gigs of RAM in it, Windows is using most of it. Well, how does it get away with actually functioning properly if it's only got a gig left and you loaded up a bunch of stuff? Well, how it gets away with that is the virtual swap file. And for instance, if you have one of those HP streams, one of those really low-end machines that only costs a couple $100, or a tablet, a Windows tablet, it's using solid state drive for the storage, and so it's able to kind of shuffle things around back and forth, but you do see a hit in performance. So in these days, you want about 6 gigs in order to really make sure that you can function right. And you'll notice I'm using about 50% of my RAM. Now, the bad thing about how memory works is that in Windows especially, Mac OS is a little better at handling it. But you can, if you get this up to about 3/4 use, if you're using about 70%, you'll see a tremendous slowdown on your computer. And so that's a big issue. It doesn't, it's not like a cup. We're still okay if you're at 100%, right? You can still hold that just as well as if you hold a little tiny amount of water. You can hold that whole glass and it's the same. Memory doesn't work that way. It'll use that swap file more and more. And swapping back and forth between your hard disk to actual memory takes time, and it slows the computer down. What's meant by a bottleneck is that if somebody was to call you on the phone and say, man, my computer's running really slow, you would need to come into Task Manager and you would need to look at the CPU utilization as opposed to the memory utilization and find out usually which one of these is the bottleneck. Which one of them, the neck of a bottle becomes smaller and it slows down how much liquid is being poured out of that. So the bottleneck on a computer is something that's restraining and restricting the processes that are happening and slowing it down. And so, if somebody said this machine was running slow, which it isn't, it does just fine, I would be in here looking at, well, which one of these is the problem? Do I need more memory? Do I need a faster CPU so I can chunk through this stuff quicker? What's happening? And of course, if you're dealing, you move on in this career and you become a server support person, then you're looking at, well, how much of the disk is being used? How's the disk I/O going? Maybe CPU and memory load is low, but the disk usage is high and it's just cranking trying to save those things to file. Or maybe it's the Ethernet. Maybe the network is causing the problem, right? So the bottleneck is whatever is slowing you down. And to understand what is the bottleneck, you have to understand those basic components. You don't have to be, into all the technicalities. You just have to know the GPU is going to provide graphics to the screen. Wi-Fi and Ethernet are my network connections. Disk is going to be saving and retrieving from the hard disk. Memory is going to be my temporary space where all my stuff is running. And then the CPU is going to be this, what's making it happen, right? And so you'd be looking at these going, which one? Now, just a little note, I'm going to end this presentation, but a little note is that these days, somebody calls and says, my computer is running slow. Your next question should be, when did you see this slowdown? One thing that happens in this time that we live in is we get Trojans and viruses, and that's really the main thing that happens. They probably have a fast enough CPU, and they probably have enough memory, but Trojans behave very badly. Viruses behave very badly. People get paid for that stuff, and we're not going to look at that here. They get paid for that. And so usually when somebody gets infected with one, within several days, 4 to 7 days, they'll have at least 7 others, if not 10 to 15 others. And so these viruses and Trojans are going out and, well, especially Trojans, not necessarily viruses. This malware is going out and getting other malware and putting it on the computer. When that happens, that's using the CPU. And when that happens, it's using the memory. And so you can be filled up with just all these Trojans and tasks that are running that you don't want running. So that's the first thing usually you look at. We will, go on with more of this in other videos.